Today's daf we're going to be learning is Kiddushin Daf Samach Aleph. Today's daf is dedicated to the families of those killed, injured, missing, or taken hostage. We're praying for you and wishing you much continued strength, and obviously for improvement of the general situation. Okay, we are now going to get started, reminding you of the Mishna that we're involved in. We're going to start with the last few words of the previous daf, the last three words. There was a Mishna that said if a husband betroths a woman with the condition that, or stipulation that he has a beit core of a fowl, okay, a certain size of a field. It's actually 75,000 square amot, okay? So it really doesn't matter. You could say any amount. So we said that we check. And if he has that size field, then she's betrothed. If not, obviously we did say, well, maybe we have to be concerned he has, and then it would be what we call Kiddushin Safek. But our Mishna is talking about, at least according to the way the Gemara understood, how we know she would be definitively betrothed to this man. So now the Gemara points out that by hekdesh, there's something else. And now we're really going to get into measuring. How do we measure ultimately when we get to the very end of this section before the next Mishna? We're going to say, what does this apply in Kiddushin as well? Okay, what is we're talking about? We're talking about if I have a field, but in that field, I have an area that right now can't be planted. Okay, and we'll talk about in a minute. There's either a big ditch in it, or there's a big stone that's blocking my ability to plant there. So is that included or not? So the first thing we're going to do is point out that there's a pasuk in Sefer Vayikra, which talks about what happens if I sanctify a field. What value? How do we evaluate the value? We all know that land fluctuates in price. So the Torah actually says, okay, we'll read Vayikra chapter 27, pasuk 16, 15, I think 16. If you take from your ancestral field and you sanctify it to God, this, by the way, is a beit core. Okay, it's the same size we were talking about before. A beit core will be evaluated at 50 shekel kesef. Okay, their shkalim. It's worth a lot more than 50 shekel nowadays. Their 50 shkalim is the value of a field. So now that's the size of a beit core. Again, what is a beit core? It's the amount that I could plant seeds that will produce a certain amount of this core, is the amount that the seeds will produce of growth. So it's an area that I would plant that could produce that amount of growth. So now they say, so the basic amount is for a beit core field, okay, which in the Gemara, the words in the Torah are a little bit different. It's zera homer se'orim. Okay, that's the amount of se'orim that you could plant. That's a beit core. If you sanctify that, this is the Mishna. Hamakdish sadeu b'shnat hayovel, sorry, not shnat, very important. In the time when the Jubilee year is happening, okay, when people keep the Jubilee year, which ended very early, but they used to keep the Jubilee year, okay, not in the Second Temple time already, but they used to keep the Jubilee year. And the times when we keep the Jubilee year, that's the amount, okay, which means that if I have very good quality fields and you have a poor quality field, it doesn't matter. It's the quantity, the size of the field rather than the quality of the field. So our fields are worth the exact same. When it's not the Jubilee year, and you can look at the first Rashi, he explains all this, when it's not the Jubilee, when there is no Jubilee year happening, when we don't keep Yovel anymore, like nowadays, we don't keep Yovel. So again, we don't have a temple anymore, but if you were to sanctify something to the temple in the time of, let's say, the Second Temple time period, it would go by its value. But this value that's a set value, we've learned already many times where the Torah gives it, not many, but there's a bunch. Torah gives a set value like Pidyon Ben and Erchin. We've talked about all these things before. Also, the field has a set value, 50 shekel. So now if you sanctify your field, by the way, it's interesting. It's the same value as a person, which is interesting, right? A male between the ages of 20 and 60, I should specify. Male between the ages of 20 and 60 is worth also 50 shekel. So if you sanctify your field, b'shat hayovel, notem b'zera chomer sorim 50 shekel kesef. So for every beit core you have that size, you give 50 shekel. But hayu nikaim amukim asarat tvachim. It's going to sound already like Sukkah and Eruvin, Shabbat, right? Where we talked about domains. And what makes something its own domain? Well, a depth of 10 tvachim, 10 handbreadths, is already significant. So if you have a ditch that's 10 tvachim deep, or you have stones that are 10 tvachim high, the space that it takes up, right now we're just talking about the height, but the length and width that takes up within your field is going to be deducted from the amount of that field. If it's any less than 10 tefachim deep or 10 tefachim high, then it will be counted. This is what we're going to call it's tafel. It's secondary to the field. If it's any less than that, it's not its own domain. So it's already considered secondary to the field and part of the field. But the Gemara that asks on this Mishna, just because there's a stone there, so you can remove the stone and use the space. Now, I understand the space is big enough to be its own space. So let's say, right, I could remove the stone, or let's say it's a ditch. I could fill the ditch with soil and plant there. So I understand that it's kind of its own space within here, just like we've had a Reshuda Yachid that's 10 Tvachim high and 4x4 amot wide, right? We say when it comes to Shabbat, that is its own space in and of itself. So I could see it's its own space. So you're not going to count it as part of the field. But let's say you have a field. Let's say your sadeh is worth a beit core, even without that space. So you give your 50 shekel, but then you should do proportionally, as if it's its own field, this space that's 10 tefachim high. So if it's 4x4 cubits, let's say, so you give that amount, right? Compare it to what's the ratio of that to a beit core, and give that the same ratio out of 50 shekel. So that's what they're basically saying. Since theoretically, just because there's a stone there or there's a ditch there doesn't mean, okay, the stone is a little tricky. Some people say it's really only talking about a ditch because the stone that tall might actually be impossible to move. And we'll see that come up in the Gemara in a bit. Maybe they're only talking about the ditch, but the ditch theoretically could just be filled with soil. Okay, not the easiest thing, but you could fill a ditch that big with soil, put a lot of soil in, and then you could plant. So it's theoretically able to be plantable. So theoretically, you should have to give that amount by itself. Okay, we understand, not part of the field, it's its own domain, but still, it should be counted. If you want to say, well, maybe the Torah said 50 shekel for a beit core. Well, maybe that means that it has to be a beit core in order for you to have to give that 50 shekel amount. If it's any less, we don't do proportionally. Well, that's definitely not true. How do we know? From the following source, we're going to see that you give it proportionally, depending on, right, if it's half a core, you'll give 25. If it's a quarter, you'll give 12 and a half, right? And then you'll go and then on. Uriminu, how do we know this? Because it says in a Braita, sadeh. Okay, the pasuk says, im b'steach huzato. Matamulamar, why does it add sadeh? It's obvious there we were talking about fields. Lefisha nemar zerach homer solim b'chamishim, since it gives you an amount, 50 shekel for a zerach homer, which is again this beit core amount. And li ala sheikdish binyan hazeh. Well, maybe it means only if you gave, means you need a minimal amount of a beit core. Even a rova tirkav minayin. Okay, these are all measurements. Okay, starting with a letech, which is half a core, to half a letech, and so on and so on. How do you know that even that you give, again, the proportional amount? Talmud lamar sadeh mikomakom. Because it says field, it means any field you own. So if you are makdish any field, it doesn't need to be a minimum amount. You give proportionally to what it is. So basically back to square one. Why don't we say that those areas that are 10 tefachim deep, a ditch there, since you can plant in it, even though you can't plant today, but you can fix it up and plant, why wouldn't that be considered in and of itself? You'd have to give that amount to the temple. Amar Ukva Brachama, remember his name because he's going to come up in the next section, also saying something different there. We must be talking about a ditch that's full of water that can't be planted. If it's full of water, you can't stick soil in it, and therefore you won't be able to plant it. And this is why I said we get back to this. It's there in the Mishna right next to a giant stone, which usually can't be moved. A stone that's 10 tefachim high would probably be too hard to move. And therefore, from here, you see that it must be referring to an area that cannot be planted. Okay, so now we're going to assume when it comes to sanctifying, if you have in your field a space, for whatever reason, it can't be planted, that's not a field. A field is something that can be planted. So that part is not going to be part of the calculation of how much you have to pay to the temple to redeem that field. Now the Gemara is going to point out, okay, so now they say, before we get to the next section, there's one more question. If it's an area that can't be planted, then why does it have to be less than more than 10 tefachim to say it doesn't count in the count? Not part of the measurement. If it's 9 tefachim deep and you can't plant in there because it's full of water, also it shouldn't be part of the count. To which they answer, Hanu nagne da'ara mikru or shidra da'ara mikri. These are words that they use. The one is the spine of the land, and nagne, I'm not sure exactly how they translate it, but these are all secondary to the land. Because it's not its own domain, this again goes back to all of the laws of Shabbat. It might be 9 tefachim deep, but that's not considered enough of its own reshut, its own domain, which means that it's basically, you might have a little patch that can't be planted, but that's not significant because we're talking about big patches that are considered, big ditches that are considered a reshut, a domain in and of itself. So even if you have a space that's full of water that can't be planted, that's 9 tefachim deep, it's still not going to be considered, a problem. It does count in the count because it's secondary to the land. Okay, so you're telling me it's basins of the land is a way to say it, either basins of the land, that's obviously a reference to the ditches. The spine is like a spine sort of sticks out, right? It's tall. So that's the stone. Now the Gemara is going to go to the same situation, but by a mecher, by a sale. Okay, so one was I sanctified land, and then I have to give its value to the temple. The other is a sale. Now, in a sale, what's the difference? Well, the difference is that someone else is getting the land. In sanctification, no one's getting the land. I'm just giving the value of the land to the temple. When it comes to a sale, there's someone on the other side. Now, someone on the other side doesn't really want to get land that's got a big ditch in it, whether it's filled with water, or whether it's not filled with water, okay? Because that's just an annoyance for them that there's this big ditch in the middle of the land. So, gabe mecher tznan, we're going to see it's different with a sale. I tell you, listen, I'm going to sell you a bait core of afal. Okay, so far this is exactly the same. If it's 10 tefachim deep, 10 tefachim high stone, it doesn't doesn't count in the measurement. Any less than that, it is part of, because it's secondary to the field. But here comes Mar Ukva Bar Chama. Remember, what did Mar Ukva Bar Chama say the first time? We're talking about ditches that are full of water and can't be planted. But in this case, Mar Ukva Bar Chama, when I sell you this land, even if they're not filled with water, if it has a ditch that's 10 tefachim deep, not part of the deal, okay? You basically can demand from me more land from somewhere else, right? Because this is not, or more land, right, to put the border a little farther out to make up for that ditch. My time. People don't want a field that's supposed to be one field, but it looks like 2 or 3 fields because it has these ditches in between. That's an annoyance for people. So clearly I didn't want to buy that. I didn't want those spaces, and therefore you have to give me more. So now the big question, and this is why we brought this all up here, because we didn't talk yet about Kiddushin at all. We talked about sanctifying land. We talked about sale. What about in Kiddushin? When he says to the woman, you're betrothed to me, and I'm on the condition that I have a beit korban. Now, he's not giving it to her. If he was giving it to her, maybe you could claim it was like a sale. But here, he's just saying, I own this. So which category does it fall into? To which the Gemara says, right, they say, so if he has a beit core, but he has these big ditches that are 10 tefachim deep, do we deduct that from the amount and then say, oh, the condition wasn't fulfilled and she's not betrothed? Or do we say, no, it's like hekdesh where it doesn't make a difference? Seems like it's more like hekdesh. Why? Now, we saw this in a Hava Mini yesterday, a suggestion that we rejected, but here they actually accept it and they say, he could say, what do you care that there's a ditch? I'm the one who's going to do the hard work to fill up the ditch and make it plantable. So it doesn't really matter to you. In the end, I have a field that potentially could plant a beit core, and that's what I told you I had. So it should work. Okay. New Mishna. Now, because we've been talking about conditions in marriage, now we get to a very, very famous machloket. Rabbi Meir Omer, Kol tnai she'eno ketnai b'nei Gad u'b'nei Reuven eno tnai. Okay, if you're going to make a condition, it has to be what we call a tnai kaful, a double condition, meaning you have to say, if I do this, or if you do this, then that. And if not, then that will happen. Okay? This is what we call, you don't say, Michlal lava tashomea hen, right? From the no, you can understand what the yes is, right? You can't make inferences like that. Okay? The second opinion is going to say, of course you can. If you say if this, then it's obvious, then if that, what's going to be? Okay? Assuming that it's the opposite, right? Like, you're going to be betrothed to me if I give you 200 zuz. So you'd have to say according to Rabbi Meir, and if I don't give you 200 zuz, you won't be betrothed to me. Rabbi Gamliel is going to say, what are you talking about? That's obvious. You don't need to say that. If the condition is, if I give you 200 zuz, then obviously if I don't give you 200 zuz, you're not going to be betrothed to me. Why do you need to spell that out? So Rabbi Meir says the reason you need to spell it out is because in the Torah, where do we see a condition? The most famous condition is, or stipulation, is the tnai to the sons of Gad and the sons of Reuven. What happened there? So they wanted land on the other side of the Jordan, right? They didn't want land in the land of Israel. And they said, right, this is better for our flocks of sheep and all that. We have a lot of livestock. We want to live on that side of the Jordan. And Moshe wasn't so happy with this, right? But in the end, they come up with this agreement. And basically they say, Moshe says, Im ya'avru b'nei Gad b'nei Reuven itchem et hayarden, kol chalutz l'milchama lifnei Hashem. He says, listen, he thought maybe they were just trying to get out of war. He said, listen, right, interesting to be talking about this right now. In fact, Shuli Mishkin put up a post. I didn't have a chance to read it, but put up a post about the Bnei Gad and the Bnei Reuven. So in war, you can read it. But he says the following. If Yavru Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven chalutzim, if you go fight the war to conquer the land, lifnei Hashem, before God, v'nichbesha aretz lifnechem, and the land will be conquered before you. Unitatem lahem et eretz hagilad lachuzad. Then you will get the Gilad, that's the land on the other side of the Jordan. You will get that land. Now this, by the way, they had already conquered from Sichon and Og. So you will get that land to conquer, to set. Now, what's the obvious then? And if you don't, then you won't get this land, right? So, im lo ya'avru chalutzim itchem. Now, it says, but if you don't go, v'nochazu b'tochachem be'eretz Yisrael. Now, what does it mean? Sounds like if you don't go, right, then what's the second side? You will inherit with your brothers in Israel. In other words, they didn't want to go to Israel. So basically, what they're saying is, if you didn't go, then if you don't go fight, well, then you're going to get a portion in the land of Israel like your brothers. So it's actually, you can already see it's a little bit tricky. What was the obvious if not? If not, you're not going to get any land. If not, you're going to get land in the land of Israel. If not, you're going to get 1/12 of, you have to remember, Israel conquered the other side of the Jordan, the Eretz HaGilad, and they're going to conquer Israel. So you're going to end up with this whole big land. You'll get 1/12 of everything, seems like, okay? So it's a little bit unclear here whether that second part is necessary or not necessary, and we're going to see, it's actually a little bit complicated, this figure, because we're going to go through a bunch of different, what could have been and different ways of viewing it. So right now, Rabbi Meir says, let's go back to the Mishna. If it's not like this, where you say if this and then that, then it's not a good condition. Why did it have to spell out both? It was obvious what it was going to be without, and therefore there was no need to spell it out. Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel aware. Of course, Moshe needed to spell that out because it wasn't really clear, as I mentioned just before. Not exactly so clear what would happen. Now comes Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel and says, listen, if Moshe hadn't said anything, you might have thought, maybe they won't even get a portion in Israel. In other words, maybe they're going to get zero, right? Maybe, okay, you don't want to fight? You're out. You're kind of wiped out of the Jewish, the Jewish dream. You're not going to get anything. Okay, you don't want the land, so, you won't get it. If you fight, you'll get what you want on the Gilad side. If not, you're not going to get anything. Soon we're going to adapt what really Rabbi Chanina is going to say, and that's why this gets confusing. It's always back to what would have been had he not said this, okay? The first thing I want to point out before we move on is that Rabbi Yonatan Milunil gives a bit of a reason for a tnai kaful, because it's a little hard to understand. It seems pretty clearly obvious, and in a case where it is obvious, like if I give you 200 zuz, you'll be betrothed, and if I don't give you 200 zuz, you won't be betrothed, you don't really need to say that. So Rabbi Yonatan Milunil, who's one of the Rishonim, he explains the reason for this is that sometimes people say things and they're not really serious about it. How many times do parents say to their children, if you don't do this, this is going to happen to you, or if you do this, I'll reward you. Right now, it's always positive reinforcement, right? So just because you say, if you do this, you'll get to watch a movie tonight, it doesn't mean if you don't do this, you won't get to watch a movie tonight, right? Maybe you're going to let them watch the movie anyway, right? You're not really serious about it. How many times do we make empty threats? And maybe you're not serious unless you really spell it out. If you say, if you do this, we can watch a movie. And if you don't do it, we cannot watch a movie. Already, it's much more serious, okay? And then you really mean what you say. So that's one possible explanation as to what tnai kaful is. Another thing to point out before we move on is that there's a big debate about whether Rabbi Meir holds this in every single condition, or does this not apply to monetary things, and perhaps only, and that's why it's here, Kiddushin, Gitin, the things that affect why they're much more serious than monetary issues, because there's Eshadish involved, Karet, Arayot, right? There's all sorts of ramifications, whether a Kiddushin is valid or not valid. So it's possible that Rabbi Meir only says it there. Also, there's a debate whether, even if we say Rabbi Meir says it everywhere, do we hold like him only in Kiddushin and Gitin and not in monetary issues? So there's a lot of behind the scenes discussions about all this whole topic. So now the Gemara starts off with Shapir Ka'amalei Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel Rabbi Meir. He's totally right. Kind of like I said before, it's really not so clear what Moshe meant. If he hadn't said the second line, what would have been? What would they have gotten? Maybe they really would have gotten nothing. And that's not what is true, right? What's true here is they're going to get a 12th of, and we'll see this becomes clear, what it actually means, means you're going to get even in Eretz Canaan. You're going to get a 12th of the Gilad and a 12th of Eretz Canaan. In other words, you want all your land to be, you want to get all of Eretz Gilad. Well, if you don't go, you'll get land, but you'll get a 12th of everything. Everything will be split up equally among the tribes. So Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel is a good claim, to which Rabbi Meir says to him, Amar lecha Rabbi Meir, or Rabbi Meir could say, if you think it's not coming for tnai kaful, well then, now we thought until now that Rabbi Meir meant the entire pasuk is unnecessary, the whole second pasuk. Now we're going to say the following. Lichtov ve'im lo yavru v'nochzu b'tochachem be'eretz Canaan lamalim. Turning now to Amud Bet. Says it wasn't the whole second pasuk I think is unnecessary that taught us that you needed tnai kaful. No, it's again. As soon as it's unnecessary, it must be teaching something else. It's teaching tnai kaful. Comes from Meir, he says, no. If the pasuk, I didn't mean the whole pasuk, the words Eretz Canaan are unnecessary. Why? Because comes Rabbi Meir and he says the following. If Moshe had said to them, if you don't go in, v'nochazu b'tochachem, what does that mean? You will inherit among your people. Okay, now what's among your people if not in Israel? That's where they're inheriting. You'll inherit with them. So therefore, be'eretz Canaan is totally not necessary. You don't need to say in Eretz Canaan. Obviously, it means in Eretz Canaan. Where else your brother's going to be if not Eretz Canaan? So those are the words that are unnecessary. And because they appear in the second part, it shows you those words are there to teach you tnai kaful. To which, right, so Shema Mina, from there you can learn l'tnai kafulu da'ata. Those words comes to teach you tnai kaful. Here's where it starts to get confusing now. Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel now says, what's his retort? He says, "Ilo katav Rachmana Eretz Canaan." He has to prove his point that pasuk is necessary. He now has to prove not that the whole second verse is necessary. Okay, that clearly even Rabbi Meir agrees now that it's necessary, but that the words Eretz Canaan are necessary. Now he claims, okay, and this is different from what he claimed in the Mishna. We thought that he was saying in the Mishna, again, what is Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel? His claim is we wouldn't have known what to think if, right, or we would have thought incorrectly if we didn't have the second verse. What did he say? And this, I'm prefacing this because we're going to get to this. The Gemara is going to spell this out, and it's a little bit confusing. Originally, in the Mishnah, Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel thinks that if you didn't have the second pasuk, we would have thought maybe they won't inherit at all, 0. At this point, he's going to change that line. Okay, and later the Gemara is going to say, but he's saying, and this is different than what he said in the Mishnah. And in the end, they're going to resolve that he went through different stages. Once he understood Rabbi Meir better, he changed his reason, his opinion about the pasuk. Okay, so again, let's make it clear what the first stage is before we get to stage 2. Stage 1 is that Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel says without this second pasuk, you would have thought they would inherit nothing. Comes the second pasuk to say, no, they inherit, right? They inherit the land, and they're going to get a 12th of, again, everything, a 12th of the Gilad and the 12th of Israel. Now he's going to say something different. Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel is going to say the following, because again, already Rashi says, v'nechazu b'tochachem is coming to tell you, right? That's not obvious. That's needed. You are going to get some land. But what do you need Eretz Canaan for? Really nothing, because obviously you're getting land in Eretz Canaan. That's clear. Eretz Canaan is teaching you tnai kaful. Comes Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel and he says, "Ilo katav Rachmana be'Eretz Canaan, Okay, here's a whole different way of understanding it. He says, what would I have thought? Because now the whole thing is on not why did you need the whole second pasuk? It's why did you need the words Eretz Canaan? Because if you said, if you don't go in and you don't go fight, you will get land with the people, I would have thought, not in Israel, but in the Gilad. They wanted land in the Gilad. They didn't want land in Israel. So basically what you want all of the land. Well, if you don't go fight, you're not going to get all the land. You'll just get a 12th of the land that you want, but only a 12th of it. Okay. And this is the exact opposite of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir thought they would get land, right? What did he say? If it didn't say Eretz Canaan, it's obvious what land are they going to get if not Israel? Now, first of all, let's just think conceptually, what's the difference? Rabbi Meir thinks, what would be the punishment? The punishment is, you want land in the Gilad, that's the land you like, you're not going to get any of it if you don't fight. And Rabbi Chanina and Gamliel are saying, you're not going to fight for Israel? You're not going to get anything in Israel, and you're only going to get a 12th of what you really want, okay? In other words, Rabbi Chanina is like, of course you're not going to get in Israel if you didn't fight to go into Israel. So therefore, the obvious would have been, Nochazu b'tochachem is, you will inherit with your brothers. What will you inherit with your brothers? The part that you want, you'll only get a 12th of. Again, each tribe, Reuben will get a 12th and God will get a 12th. Okay. And what it's saying is you won't get the whole thing that you want. You'll only get a 12th, but of course you're not going to go into Israel. You didn't fight for Israel. How could you even get land in Israel? So, right, they're showing different conceptual in terms of like what the punishment is. Is it more of a punishment to get, right, not to get into Israel and saying, for sure, you don't deserve any of that? Or is it saying you're going to get a 12th of Israel? And that is basically, instead of getting all of what you want, you're going to get a 12th of, we'll basically erase what you wanted and we'll just divide the land up equally among everybody. But you'll still get something according to this interpretation. The first way we heard Rabbi Chanina, the assumption was, if you didn't have a tnai kaful, you would have thought they got nothing. Here, you're definitely going to get a 12th. And what you would have thought is that you only get a 12th of the Gilad. And then comes the words Eretz Canaan to teach you, no, you're actually going to get a 12th of everything. Okay? So, Havamina, let's just read it again. Iloka, Rabbi Chanina and Gamliel, starting from line 2 of the Amud Bet. Iloka to Rahmana be'Eretz Canaan. If it didn't say Eretz Canaan, I would have thought Havamina b'nochzu b'tochachem be'Eretz Gilad. You're not going to go into the land of Israel at all, I would have thought, because you didn't fight for the land. And therefore, right, you will get a 12th of what you really want, which is much smaller than what you really want. Aval Eretz Canaan klalo, but definitely you're not going to get in the land of Israel. And therefore, you need the word. The whole point he was trying to say is why you need the word Eretz Canaan. You need it there, because if you didn't have that, you would have thought they don't get land of Israel at all. Comes the pasuk to teach you, in the end, they're going to get a 12th of everything. Okay? Now you have to remember, both him and Rabbi Meir agree that in the end, if they don't go into the land of Israel, the way we eventually understand this pasuk is, you will get a 12th of Israel and whatever other land Israel conquered on the other side of the Jordan in Eretz Gilad. But the question is what you would have thought had the pasuk not said. Okay, it's a matter of where the stress is. So Rabbi Meir, betochachem kol echad ilu mashma. Betochachem means wherever your brothers are. Betochachem would include Israel, the Transjordan area, and therefore there's nothing, right? The Eretz Canaan is totally unnecessary. So that's the machloket between them in terms of, are there words unnecessary in this pasuk that we can darshan to say tnai kaful or not? Tanya. Now we bring a bright, and this will help visualize the whole thing, even though it's a bit of a strange example. It's just strange because it's hard to imagine someone would do this. You can't really imagine the logic, but this is, they have to bring some sort of parable to understand this situation. So Amar Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel, Mashal lama davar domeh. Right? It's hard to exactly understand this concept. So they want to give you a parable, right? So Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel says, here's a parable to my opinion. La'adam shaya mechalek nechasav lebanav. Okay, imagine a father, it's very similar, right? A father dividing up his inheritance to 3 sons. Okay, in this case, we're going to talk about 12. Give a more simple example, 3 sons. Amar ploni b'ni yigash sadeh ploni. Okay, it says, son number 1, you get this field. Okay, let's go. Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. Reuven, you get this field. Ploni b'ni yigash sadeh ploni. Shimon, you get this field. Uploni b'ni yitei matayim zuz. Levi, I'm going to treat you a little differently than everyone else. That's why it's a little bit strange. You're going to have to pay me 200 zuz. If you pay me 200 zuz, yirash sadeh ploni, you'll get the third. This is a reference to Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven about getting the Transjordan area, the Gilad. So if you pay me, which is if you fight, then you'll get your land that you want, right? This third one. Ve'im lo yitain. Now here comes the flip side. Im lo yitain yirash im echav b'shar nechasim. If you don't give me 200 zuz, then I'm going to just divide all the land equally between you and all your brothers. Now, why is he now going to inherit with all his brothers? Meaning, okay, now you have to explain some things that aren't exactly written in here. The basic assumption is if he hadn't done the double, what would have been? Reuven gets a field, Shimon gets a field, Levi was going to get the third field, but he didn't pay the money. So the third field will be equally divided between the brothers. It's exactly what Rabbi Chanina and Gamliel said about the land, right? All the brothers will go into the land of Israel. You'll get nothing there without the tnai kaful, right? This is what we would have thought. You would have gotten nothing. The only thing you would have gotten was, you want the Gilad? Okay, you'll get it, but you'll only get 1/12 of it. Okay, or 2/12, right, between Reuven and Gad. Comes the tnai kaful to say, no, you're going to get 1/12 of everything, not 1/12 of the Gilad, 1/12 of Israel plus the Gilad. You're not going to get 1/3 of the field that you wanted. You're going to get 1/3 of all the property together. Now, you wouldn't have come to that conclusion were it not for the tnai kaful, and that's Rabbi Chanina's whole point. That's why you can't learn from here that every tnai has to be a tnai kaful. No, he says generally, from saying no, we understand what the yes will be, but when it's going to be something different, then we need the kaful. Okay, and that's his mashal. To which the Gemara asks now a question, which I kind of referenced before. This mashal and this braita is not the way Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel appeared in the Mishna. In the Mishna, it sounded like he thought you get nothing. Okay, let's just go back to the words of the Mishna. It says in the Mishna, you would have thought that even in Canaan you wouldn't get, meaning you wouldn't get Megillah, you wouldn't get in Canaan, you wouldn't get anything. That's zero. In this mashal, he thinks, again, we're only at stage one, before the tnai kaful comes in, which is to teach you that's not the case. According to the Mishna, you would have thought you get nothing. According to the Braita, you would have thought you get 1/12 of the Gilad and you just don't get anything in Israel. That's very different. So how can Rabbi Chanina in the Mishnah appear different as he appears in the Braita? Which I already kind of told you this, which is it's at different stages. So let's read the problem first inside. This mashal is not like it appears in the Mishnah, because hatam katane, there it says, yesh b'mashma shafilu be'eretz Canaan lo yinchalu. Sounds from the Mishnah like we thought you wouldn't get anything even in Israel. Alma kfela la'eretz Gilad nami mahani. The kefel comes to teach you are going to get in Israel and you're going to get in the Gilad. V'hacha katane, miga, but here it says, in this braita, it says, mi garam lo lirash mechav b'shar nechasim, kfelo garam lo, alma kfelo l'shar nechasim u'dekamahani. In the braita, it was clear you're going to get the 1/12 in the Gilad. The only chiddush was you're also going to get the 1/12 in Israel. But from the Mishnah, it sounded like you were going to get 0, not in the Gilad, not in Israel. And the tnai kaful is teaching you, no. If you don't go, you'll get 1/12 of the Israel, and you'll also get the Gilad. But also getting the Gilad is not necessary according to the Braita, because that was obvious. Remember, the obvious with the 3 brothers is obviously you're going to get 1/3 of the sedeh that I'm promising you. It's just, you'll either get 1/3 or you'll get complete, depending on whether you fulfill the condition or not. The chiddush is that if you don't get it, well, then if you don't do it, right, once the tnai kaful comes in, it tells you you're actually going to get 1/12 of everything. So how could Rabbi Chanina and Gamliel appear in the Mishnah as thinking one thing? Again, it's all in the first stage. In the end, the conclusion is the same. They're going to get 1/12 of everything. But it's a matter of what we would have thought and what the tnai kaful is coming to teach us. The tnai kaful in the Mishnah is coming to teach us you're going to get land both in Israel and the Gilad, which you didn't think you were going to get any land if you hadn't had the tnai kaful. And I'm just repeating myself because I found it confusing and I want to just make sure you have it clear. And in the second stage, which again, we'll see in a minute, it's like 2 stages. But in the second source we saw, the Braita, it seems like no matter what, we would have assumed you would have gotten the 12th in the Gilad. The only question, right, in the kefel was needed there. This extra part was needed to tell you, and that's why it specifically said, again, this is his whole claim against Rabbi Meir about the Eretz Canaan. Rabbi Meir said in this, right, in our Gemara, not in the Mishnah, in our Gemara, that it's the words Eretz Canaan that are unnecessary. And he said that words in Eretz Canaan are very necessary, because without them, you would have thought they would have gotten land in the Gil'ad. Comes the thing to tell you that no, it's also in Eretz Canaan. Okay, so now they're going to answer. Okay, so again, there it says, Efilu Eretz Yisrael, and here it says, right, that even there you wouldn't get anywhere, and here it seems to include you would have gotten at least in the Gil'ad. So they're, so they answer, Lo kasha, ha mikame d'nemale Rabbi Meir v'nochzu, ha lebatar d'nemale Rabbi Meir v'nochzu. Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel changed his argument once he understood Rabbi Meir better. In stage one, he really thought that Rabbi Meir was saying the whole second pasuk is unnecessary. Im lo, right? That's how we read him in the Mishna. You didn't need the second part. If you go into the land, Rabbi Meir said, you will conquer, right? And you will then get all that you want in Eretz Gilad. If not, it's obvious that you're going to, right? Now, he said you don't need that second pasuk. Now, it's a little tricky because it really isn't so obvious. And that's exactly what develops further on in their argument. But he thought that the whole second pasuk is not necessary. Came Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel said, what do you mean? Of course the second pasuk is necessary. You would have thought, if not, maybe you inherit nothing. Comes the second pasuk to say you inherit. Rabbi Meir says, but you inherit, right? It's obvious you inherit in Israel. Eretz Canaan is unnecessary. Once he says, my words, that where I'm learning it from is not the second pasuk. I agree you need the second pasuk, Rabbi Meir says. At stage one, Rabbi Yeshua thought he meant the whole second pasuk. He said, what do you mean? Without the second pasuk, you would have thought nothing. Once Rabbi Meir changes his argument and says, or modifies his argument and says, no, you didn't understand me. I meant, of course you need the second pasuk. It's really not clear. Maybe you're right. You would have gotten nothing. Comes the second pasuk to say, if you don't fight, you'll get land, just not what you wanted, right? You'll get, let's say, a 12th, right? Not clear what Rabbi Meir is saying, a 12th of what? But now, Rabbi Meir is really saying you'll get a 12th of Israel and really everything we conquered, okay? You'll get a 12th. Therefore, you don't need the words Eretz Canaan, because where else if not Eretz Canaan? Comes Rabbi Yeshua and says, Rabbi Chanina, and he says, what do you mean? No. Then he says, if that's your argument, so you're right. It can't be nothing. You claim, right, with Nochazu b'tochachem is obvious, you're going to get some land. So what does Rabbi Yeshua say? The some land that's obvious, though, is in the Gil'ad. Eretz Canaan is necessary because you might not have thought you would get anything in Israel. Comes the tnai kaful, say, no, you're not only going to get in the Gil'ad, you're also going to get in Israel. Again, with the logic being, if you don't fight, you're not going to get land. Okay, hard to talk, right? It's interesting to talk about this while we're talking about fighting in Israel and trying to, in this case, keep our land. So that's in the end how we understand this machloket. So this section was I found it a little bit confusing. I hope that I managed to make order. We're basically talking about stages in the argument. In the first stage, we thought that Rabbi Meir was saying, you don't need the whole second pasuk, in which case Rabbi Yeshua said, what do you mean? Without that second thing, you might have thought they don't get anything. Once Rabbi Meir says, no. You get something. You don't need Eretz Canaan. And that's where I learned tnai kaful comes Rabbi Chanina, I keep confusing his name. Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel, and he says, you definitely need Eretz Canaan because you would have thought you do get something from Nochazu b'tochachem. It's obvious you get something. So you're going to get it in Gil'ad, 112. Comes Eretz Canaan to say you're also going to get a portion in Eretz Canaan, and that was what his mashal was all about. Okay, that was the hard part of our daf. Now we're up to a very simple part, which is, and it's going to continue into tomorrow's daf, which is we're now going to take all sorts of times in the Torah, or the Nevi'im, or the prophets, where it says, if this, then that, and if not, then that. And we're going to say, well, Rabbi Meir, here's good proof for your case. This is all going to work very well for you because why is there a tnai kaful here if not to teach, right? Because all conditions need to be doubled. To which we're going to say to Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel, why did they say it by Negad, but Reuven, you proved to us, okay, why it was necessary. But in these cases, it doesn't seem necessary. It seems obvious what the other side is. So why was it necessary? In each case, we're going to explain why Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel thought it was necessary. So starting with the first one, Bishlam ala Rabbi Meir, they're all going to be the same structure. This makes sense according to Rabbi Meir. What? Right now we're going to see. Hainu dichtiv. We're going now to the story of Cain and Hevel. And God says to Cain a very famous line. It's very famous because there's many different ways to interpret it. Our Gemara clearly picks one interpretation. Okay, the word se'et we're going to read is not clear what it means, but we're going to read it in one way. Just know that there's other ways of understanding this pasuk. like one of the classic psukim in biblical exegesis of, different ways to do this. Hainu dichtiv im titiv se'et. If you do good, now here, the way this Gemara understands se'et means you'll be rewarded. That's if you change your ways, go in a good way, you'll be rewarded. V'im lo titiv, and if you don't change your ways, lepetach hatat roves. Okay, sin will be lurking for you, and basically meaning you'll get punished. So Ella, the Rabbi Chanina lamali. So according to Rabbi Meir, we understand God needed to spell out both sides because that's the way we do things. According to Rabbi Chanina and Gamliel, why do you need the second part? Obviously, if you go in the good way, you will be rewarded. It means, and if you don't, you will not. Now you might think this is an interesting havamina, and we're going to actually see it a few times here. You might have thought im titiv agra, if you do good, agra means you'll get rewarded. Agar is sachal. V'im lo titiv lo agra v'lo dina. But if you don't go in a good way, you won't get rewarded, but you also won't get punished. Okay, this is what we call neutral. Just nothing will happen. Kamash malan. That's why it has to teach you. No, there's reward and there's also punishment. Okay, maybe there's, you might have thought there's just a reward, kind of like we say nowadays. You should always be positive with your children and positive reinforcement, right? Don't go in the negative reinforcement. So maybe that's how, the Torah was set up. No, right? We know already, right? It's kind of funny havamina to us because it's so built into us that there's reward and punishment. But maybe it's not such an obvious concept. Bishlam ala Rabbi Meir, hainu dichtiv. Okay, now we're in a different one. This isn't going to be punishment reward. Okay, so the next two will be, but this isn't. We're talking about the servant of Abraham that goes to find a wife for Yitzchak. So he goes to the family's house, and Abraham makes him take an oath. And the oath is the following: Vayashbi'eni, and Abraham makes him take an oath. Lo tikach ishi lebini mibnot haknani im lo el beit avi telech. Okay, don't go. I'm making you take an oath that don't go anywhere else, only to my family's, right, my father's house. Then he says, "Az tinakeme alati," but you will be cleansed from this oath. Ki tavo mishpachti im lo yitznu lach v'aytanakim alati. If you go there and the family doesn't want her to marry Yitzchak, then you'll be free from my oath. Now, why did he have to double this? Right? Obviously, if they're not going to agree, then there's nothing he can do about it. He's going to be free from his oath. He did his part. So Bishlam ala Rabbi Meir hanu dichtiv az tinakeme alati. Ela Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel lamali. Why was this necessary? So Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel is going to say it was necessary. Why? Well, there's three people in this story, or three parties. There's the slave of Abraham, or the servant. There's the woman herself, and there's the family. So what this pasuk says, if the family doesn't agree, then you're free from my oath. So you might have thought, if she, let's say Rivka, wants to go, but Lavan and the family doesn't let her, right? Or Betuel and the family doesn't let her. Maybe the slave is not, or the servant is not free from his duty. And maybe if she agrees, even though the family doesn't, he has to pull her and force her to come, or force the family to give her up. Kamash malan, no. That's why it tells you if the family doesn't agree, you're free from the oath. Meaning you can't force the issue if the family's not in agreement. So then they say, notice there's another pasuk. It also says, im lo toveh isha. If the woman doesn't want to go, it also says you'll be free from my oath. So why does it say that? Lamalu. Itzrich. Again, it's going to be the reverse now. Salkadat tachamina. And this is very interesting learning at the concept of Kiddushin, how parents, right, fathers betroth their daughters, and whether the daughters have a say in the matter. So here it says the daughter has a say. Im lo toveh isha lamali. Why? Itzrich. You need it. Salkadat tachamina. Let's say the family agreed. Betuel, Lavan, they all agreed, but she didn't want to go. Maybe you can bring her against her will. Kamash malan comes to teach you. That's why I think it's so interesting in Kiddushin, because we talked a lot about how she has to agree to the marriage. Don't force it if she doesn't want to come. So basically, we took the second case and we explained why Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel says both those sides of if not are necessary for each for their own reason. Bishlam ala Rabbi Meir hainu dichtiv im b'chukotai telechu ve'im b'chukotai timasu. There's at the end of Vayikra, there's the curses, right? Parashat b'chukotai. If you go my ways, all these blessings will happen. If you don't go my ways, and then there's a very long list of curses. So why do you need both? Obviously, if you're not going to get the blessing, you're going to get the curse, and we already know the answer based on the previous. You You might have thought if you go in my ways, you'll get blessed. But if you don't go in my ways, lo bracha velo kala. Maybe it'll be neutral. You won't get blessed, but you also won't get cursed. Kamashmalan, that's why I need to tell you, no, you will get cursed. And we're going to do the same thing with the pasuk in Yeshayahu, and with that we'll finish for today. Bishlar Rabbi Meir hainu dichtiv im tovu ushmatem v'gomer. Pasuk reads like this in chapter 1 of Yeshayahu, verses 19 to 20. Im tovu ushmatem, if you go my way and listen to me, tuv haaretz tochelu, you will eat the good of the land. Ve'im timanu muritem, and if you refuse to do my ways and you rebel against me, cherev tu'uklu. I'm going to leave this phrase for tomorrow. Okay, cherev tu'uklu. You'll something eaten by a sword. You will eat a sword. It's a little bit strange. We'll get to what exactly it means. This is the next question of the Gemara. But the main problem is, Rabbi Meir makes perfect sense for him. Hainu dichtiv im tovu shmatem begomer, and im tmatu muritem begomer. Right? If you do good, it will be good. If you do bad, it will be bad. Rabbi Chanina Gamliel lamali. Again, same answer. It's needed. Why? Right? If you do good, it's good. But if you don't do good, maybe no good will befall you, but also no bad will befall you. Kamash malan, that no bad will befall you. This is basically stressing the whole concept of reward and punishment. So what we did today is a quick review. We started with this bait core. We brought a case of makdish. We brought a case of sale, and we showed they were different in terms of if you have a big ditch in it or a big stone. Then we said, where does Kiddushin fall? The case that we saw in the Mishna. And then, which we said it's like Hekdesh. And then we went to, right, which it depends if it's filled with water or not filled with water. Whereas with a sale, it doesn't make a difference. Either which way, it's not included. Then we went to this, since we were talking about conditions and stipulations, how you have to stipulate things. Do you need to say both sides or not? Where did they each get it from? And then some examples of where it seems to contradict Rabbi Chanina and Gamliel, but the Gemara responds and supports his answer according to each pasuk, right? Each way they explained it. That's it. Wishing everybody a Shabbat Shalom and more peace in Israel.